Welcome to the COSIN podcast, bringing you timely insights and strategies to succeed in the ever-evolving world of school system technology. On each episode, you'll hear from certified education technology leaders, visionary district change makers, and instructional experts who will discuss the technology topics making a difference in schools today. And now, enjoy today's show. Remote and hybrid work environments have grown in popularity over a number of years, and this trend, like so many others, has been accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. This trend is, of course, impacting schools just as it is transforming other workplaces and industries. In considering schools' teaching and learning objectives and the tools and technologies we use to best equip students with future-ready skills, predicting and understanding the future of work is an important factor. However, district leaders also have another immediate concern to address within schools. The future of work, or at least the demand from employees that we embrace the future of work, is here now. How do we redefine this within our work environments and build edtech leadership to support it? That is the exciting topic we're going to be discussing today. My guests are Steve Langford, Chief Information Officer of Beaverton School District in Oregon, Alan Miedema, Executive Director for Technology for Northshore School District in Washington, and Freddie Cox, Chief Technology Officer for Knox County Schools in Tennessee. This episode is the first of 3 conversations we're producing here in alignment with COSIN's Large District Great Minds series, in which leaders from large school districts across the country are engaging in meaningful peer conversations and working alongside COSIN to incubate and drive innovative practices designed to solve districts' unique challenges as we move into the new era of hybrid learning. So Freddie, Alan, and Steve, thank you for being here.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Let's just start with you. We'll go kind of around the horn on this first one. We'll start with you, Steve. What is the future of work, or at least how you're presently defining it within your district? And, within that, of course, we're looking ahead and we're anticipating the future of work. We know there's a lot of trends that I think we're all probably commonly working toward, but I'd also be really interested in hearing from everybody. Are there any trends in motion that you think it's important to take a second look at, or perhaps even start to push back on, as we kind of calibrate, right? What do we really advance and push forward, and what do we think is important that we maintain maybe a different way of doing things?
Thanks, Ross. Yeah, for us, the future of work, the way we kind of approached it was we seemed to be in a rush to get back to what was, as we were thinking about students and staff coming back into schools after a year and a half that was at a physical location. And so for us, the way we approached future of work was we needed to, rather than just try and replicate 2017 or 1988 or 1993, we needed to be thinking about what did we learn from a year plus of all of our staff working remotely. So what worked in that? What didn't work? What did we miss? And then use those questions and the answers to the thinking around those questions to think about, well, how do you reimagine work? So it's not what was, it is the best of what happened to us during a pretty traumatic and awful time.
Yeah, Alan, how are you looking at it?
Well, I agree with everything Steve led off there with, but I also would say that in some sense, coming from technology where it's pretty common that staff will work off hours anyways, because servers crash when they crash, it's a little bit of formalizing what we've already been doing, I think, is, I've had people work remotely. I've had people work off hours. I've had people do these things before. I've had people working off their phone on the side of a road on the way to a conference kind of things before. I think in some ways, other folks found I didn't need to necessarily be in the office to do my work. And I feel like, well, I already knew that. My people already did that. I already had people who commonly worked at home on Fridays and nobody noticed. So I think it's a bit of catching up.
How about you, Freddie?
I would agree. Our staff was comfortable with these concepts, and it kind of gave us an opportunity to showcase alternative ways that folks could work and figure out how we can move the district forward, even though things may not be, as Steve mentioned, like they were in 1993.
And so when we're planning for what the hybrid workplace should look like, a big part of that is the importance of involving those who are living it, right? So that's the folks at every level of our organizations, of a district, of a school, who this is impacting and influencing, both, I think, from the perspective of the challenges present that dictate that it really is important to have these options. For example, the traumas, the other things that you mentioned that folks are facing, to say, look, we need some flexibility here, right? We can't go back to the other way of doing it because things have just changed. But also, the comfort level of having a process that everybody thinks works, to say, some people are probably coming in and saying, look, I'm really expecting to see things change, and others are saying, I don't know, I kind of like the old way. Like, tell me more about this, right? But involving them in those conversations is important to make sure you have a plan that works for everybody. What does that collaborative process look like in your minds? Maybe we'll start with you, Alan, on this one, and just kind of that how do you engage those different stakeholders, those different roles, and kind of think through, all right, how does this plan work according to everybody's various needs?
So again, when we first started having some amount of remote learning and for our remote work, and again for us that years and years ago we started this process. One of the conversations you have right away is just really establish what a clear set of expectations are for what needs to happen and what the experience needs to be for folks. I've got staff who really don't interact with anybody non-technical all day. So for them, working off Teams, working off of email, occasionally picking up a Zoom call or picking up the phone to talk to somebody else technical is fine, and that can be done really from anywhere, right? And then I've got other staff where they need to be able to take calls from people from outside. They need someone to know that when they call the office phone, somebody's going to pick that up. So we just start with the conversation of what are the requirements for your position, what needs to happen there, and how are we going to fulfill that? And then where you do it from is almost secondary at that point. I mean, if you can do that from the Kitsap Peninsula, that's fine with me. If you need to be in an area that we call the fishbowl in our administrative center, then that's fine with me also. But we try to focus on what's the work that needs to be done.
There, a circumstance, I'm sure this has to happen from time to time with, a certain percentage, right, of the staff and faculty within a district where, as I kind of mentioned in the opening here, we're giving all this thought to the future of work. We have across every different industry these trends taking place where the expectation is that there's always options for remote or at least hybrid work, or things are evolving very rapidly, and yet it's almost was a time to remind ourselves, oh yeah, right? That applies to us now too, right? Like, we're preparing students to go out and do that, but what about our workers and our employees? And I would imagine there's certain of those folks that, like we said, who are really saying, look, I just like workers in other fields, I have an expectation of this happening. There's probably others who said, I never really thought of it that way, and that wasn't what I was expecting. And I'm not so sure about this. And you talked about the expectation setting piece of that, but I'm wondering how specifically, I guess, important that expectation setting piece is for those who are starting out, more skeptical, to say, okay, well, it's not that anybody's being forced into anything, but we need to create options, and here's why in the big picture. Just kind of as a follow-up to what you were talking about, Alan, I'm wondering, when those situations come up, right, like how important is the expectation setting coming from that angle? Because I think that's the one that sometimes we may forget to think about as much.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you that usually the conversations I was telling you about always in the past had come up after somebody had been with the district for a while. But now I think going through this experience, people have got a better sense of what do I need in my life as a worker in this environment, and hopefully that this isn't the main part of my life, right? That this is a part of my life and not my life. So for the first time, I think just about everybody we interviewed for new positions brought up the idea of what's the options for remote learning. or excuse me, I keep saying that, remote work, excuse me. And it was obvious from the interviews is for folks that was kind of a deal breaker of, is that going to be something that's on the table for me? Because I kind of feel like that's something I need in my life, and we've demonstrated that we can do this and be effective. So I guess the difference is when that conversation gets initiated and what the expectation is. It's a little bit shift in the power balance there, but I'm fine with it because I would like to have a life outside of work as well. I get where they're coming from.
Absolutely. So Steve, going back to that collaboration piece, I know, in your district, you developed a really effective process for remote work and, for these evolutions. And with process, the key thing I think about is a process only works if every step of the process is working in sync. If there's any element of it, any stage that's out of line, then the entire process breaks down. So, that's critical to it being collaborative with, okay, everybody who's involved in this needs to be on board. We need to support all. So what does that collaborative process of planning and then implementing look like in your district?
Yeah, collaboration, I think, is a continuum with maybe confrontation at one end, because it began with confrontation for us. In March of this year, we issued a statement from the district that we wanted to welcome people back to work. And that was deeply offensive to people who had been working very hard in a different location. And what we meant was back to the office, right, to do our work. We lost 3 people, one immediately due to that memo, and said that in the exit interview. And we lost 2 others because they found jobs that could let them do remote, and they didn't have confidence in us. It was a series of pretty hard conversations with the cabinet because we were not united in mind or in belief that this could be viable, even though, as Alan said, our teams in technology have been doing this for years. The problem was the rest of the organization had not. And so that's where the confrontation came into play. And so for us, I think you were spot on. The way through that was to develop a process by which there would be common understanding, common expectations, both on the employee side and with managers, because that's where the rub came. Was we had people who were in leadership positions who had never supervised and didn't understand what remote work looked like, even though we'd all lived it for a year. And I think for us, what helped was drafting the process, documenting, having the employee supervisors sign, and discuss. So there's that, creating that common understanding, I think, was key, and then providing some support and resources for other departments. I know, for example, we had some of our IT leaders on my team go train other departments and talk to them about how we do our work. And I think that helps create that common understanding, common expectations. And what we found is when you have employees that you trust and they know you trust them, they rise and give much beyond the level. If it's a transaction, and that's how we approach it as leaders, we will get a transaction from our employees. And if it's more about professionalism and trust, we get so much more than we give, in my opinion.
Freddie, of course, an important part of facilitating whatever vision we each have of the hybrid workplace is the technologies that help support that, right, and make it possible and what they do for us. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, when you're approaching this and planning it out, what's the order that you usually go through when thinking about, you have your objectives. Okay, we want to do these things because of XYZ goals that we have. This is for our staff. It's, it helps us support our students, et cetera. Also, though, you have in mind technologies you're familiar with, what you think will help with that. I mean, so do you usually think through those objectives first and then start to put the process and then map, okay, what tools might help us do this? Do you sometimes think about the tools earlier in the process and say, well, we have these things at our disposal that can help us do these things, so let's think about, which of those things we want to pursue? How do you usually approach that?
As a technologist, it's easy to jump straight to the tools. And one of the things that I've really tried to do over the past couple of years is to think about it as a design process. So rather than trying to necessarily just provide a tool, go and start with those objectives. So just like we would, design a school, we need to design a solution. It's not just providing a tool that we think, that this will fix your problem. Really to listen and hear those objectives and goals.
Freddie, I think we're going to come right back to you on kind of transitioning to a little bit of a different topic here within this, but it also relates to part of what Steve was sharing and part of our thoughts just about how in so many ways, of course, schools, the education system is unique within the way that it functions, but in so many ways right now, there are these challenges and trends across the entire economy that are being felt within schools, a shortage of candidates for certain roles, employees looking for situations that are more favorable to their needs or to the direction they think they want to go. Just significant movement at different times of the school year. That's atypical, and that is putting districts in positions to think about, do we even have enough staffing to continue to do what's on our calendar? And how do we be more competitive as an employer, perhaps, to a much greater extent than was traditionally the focus area, right? But when you take time to invest in a hybrid plan, you come up with a plan that you feel like it really works. You can communicate it to your current staff, to a potential new hire, et cetera, and say, look, here's what we have in place. Do you feel like it makes you more competitive as an employer? And have you found that to be an important thing, to do with the way things are trending?
It's been difficult as school district in the past. We had, I felt like, the upper hand in job flexibility in person, and the remote work really sort of flipped that on its head. So we've had to respond to, candidates who are finding more flexible options. They may have worked for the district for a long time. And it is important tool in our tool belt to be able to, honestly tell candidates what that looks like and how the district's responding.
Alan, what have you seen in that area?
Oh, I agree completely. I mean, one of the big offerings we had at school district was, it's never been money, right? And it's never been prestige. It's been culture and mission. And as other organizations start to formalize some of these improvements to the work culture for people, then that becomes more competitive for us. And you have candidates who say, well, I can find those things other places. Other places are offering some of those same things. Now, conversely, I think that I think this is an opportunity for us to jump on some of the things you're seeing from industry now. I know more and more people who work for a company where they geographically aren't anywhere near it, right? And I've got a consultant doing a great bit of work for me right now who does not live in the Seattle area, doesn't live in the state, doesn't live in this time zone. And she just does bang up work for me. And I know at this point, I wouldn't be able to hire her as a full-time employee, but I hope that day is not very far off, because there is literally nothing that I need her to do where I need her to be sitting in our offices. So in this time where we're having more and more trouble attracting great candidates to our place, we need to remove that geographic restriction around this. Telling somebody that they've got to move up from California to be here, where really the thought is, why do they need to move up from California to be here? There's probably 3 times a year where I need them in the office.
This episode of the COSN podcast is presented by Content Keeper and Clever. Content Keeper's cloud filtering and security platform helps schools improve instructional effectiveness and ensure student success and safety in today's hybrid learning environment. Visit contentkeeper.com to learn more. Clever brings all your learning applications into one secure portal and provides single sign-on for everyone in the district. With more time to teach and learn, schools get higher engagement in the education software they've invested in. Learn more at clever.com. Yes, Steve, have you seen a significant shift in the expectation or demand around having either a more hybrid or even more to the end of the spectrum around remote roles, either as a result of remote learning that happened during COVID, where people said, well, this is actually working pretty well in my role, and why should we go back to the way it was before? Or, I would imagine too, as each, successive graduating class comes out of universities and they're being prepared for and thinking ahead to roles that are more geographically agnostic, right? And they're considering, okay, well, this organization, this school district, there's a culture there that I really like. That's the mission that I'm passionate about. It's the kind of work I want to do, but I don't know if I want to be in person all the time. Or is that becoming much more of a demand? Is it more? There's also a matter of course, as we're developing more and more hybrid options for students, we have to evaluate the logic of saying, okay, well, doesn't it make sense that the same would apply to our faculty, right? It's not, if we're doing one and not the other, that might not make the most sense. But where do you see the pressure coming from?
Yeah, I think there's an increased expectation that work doesn't have to be confined to a geographic location. And what Freddie and Alan said are spot on. With people are now thinking about, well, this kind of a hybrid can really resonate with me. Over the last couple of months, we've had 3 positions that we needed to fill. Every single interviewee asked the question about, well, is there a possibility of remote work, and how much work can I accomplish remotely? So I think there's a greater desire than in the past to even ask that question. I think pre-pandemic, we didn't see that question coming up nearly as frequently, and now it's 100%. So I think there is this expectation that, we've done this successfully for 15, 16 months now, probably actually closing in on 2 years. And so this is becoming normalized, which is a good thing. And I think as leaders, one thing I told the superintendent, because he and I were on different sides of the table about this initially, and said, I actually don't want an IT shop staffed with people that will tolerate coming in to sit at a desk so I can look over their shoulder and make sure they're working, because we don't need those people. We need people that function at a much higher level than that. And that seemed to resonate with him as we were, collaborating, moving from confrontation to collaboration around remote work. That seemed to be something that resonates with people. This is now become normalized in our workforce. It was in IT. It's a big shift for our HR functions, our teaching and learning, our business functions. They're just not used to this. And we have to remember that we've got to bring them along too.
Now, Steve, you mentioned the onboarding piece, and I do want to acknowledge that this isn't all rosy, right?
No.
The onboarding and the culture piece, I'd say I still don't have a great handle on. As I bring people on, how do I make sure we get them into the culture and the work environment here so that they are really part of the team? We've been really lucky in North Shore that our technology department has been very stable. Right. But now we're getting into an era where we're starting to have some people retire and move on for reasons that, just that's how life goes. And I worry about as we bring new people on, and if they're working remote, and we did have some people who came on during the pandemic, how do we incorporate them into the culture most effectively? So as Steve says, transactional, so it doesn't just feel like I'm a gig worker here, that I really am part of the North Shore School District. I am part of what we're doing here. And I don't have a great handle on that piece yet, but it's very important because, I want to keep people here. And the way I'm going to keep people here is culture.
Speaking of culture, of course, there are the challenges associated with onboarding people into your culture, regardless of whether it's brick and mortar, remote, et cetera, and saying, okay, have we established a clear culture? And then what is our process for getting everybody into that? But have you found that these shifts have caused you to revisit and perhaps redefine the culture in certain ways and say, okay, we knew what our culture was before, but things are changing a lot, and now our culture is something a little bit different. And so now we're trying to onboard our new folks into it. We're also trying to, in some ways, onboard our existing team into what the new culture is, because we have changed that. Has that been something you've had to go through?
I think it's been just a little bit different than that. Excuse me, at least for us. For me, I think it's been more, we've had to get intentional about things that maybe were just more natural. You know, if I'm going to see these people 5 days a week and it's one or two folks, and just sort of incorporating them in and just noticing, hey, you know, that doesn't really seem like it's clicking for Doug over there. It's easier to pull them into that. I think now we've had to get more thoughtful, intentional, and purposeful about these things. And again, I don't know. Well, I do know. I'm not there yet, but we're getting there. I think that's going to be the hardest part of it for me.
The intentionality is important, because in an office it's easy to walk down the aisle and physically interact with people, and that's an intentional act, but it feels much more natural than a lot of the digital interactions. So making sure that we do that with purpose and intentionality is really important.
Yeah, I'd say this is probably as tough as the shift for some people, because not all jobs can be done remotely. So even in IT, we have job functions that show up every day because their jobs are not aligned to remote work as easily as others. And what Alan said is right. The heart of the matter is, how do you maintain culture and not move to just a bunch of people being independent consultants? And I wish I could say we've solved that. We haven't. What we've seen is, between our IT teams, they've gotten stronger because they had to interact all day long to accomplish the mission of the department or a project. The connective tissue between the teams in IT is something that has weakened, because we don't have those times in the kitchen where we are both getting coffee and I can look at one of our network engineers, for example, and say, well, how's your kids? We've tried to do some things to increase that. The challenge is, the workload for IT shops over the last 2 years has been so significant that when we try and take time to build culture, and we talk about how important it is and why we have to do it, I can look at a screen and see people who are just panicking because of all the things they can't do right now that have to get done. So putting the culture in the context of the trauma that people have experienced, it makes it even more challenging. And so as we think about remote work looking forward, I think we've got to figure out how to, this is the thing that will distinguish our work, is how well do our teams function together? Are they unified? Do they have that strong culture? And right now, this is something we're really struggling with, how to maintain and build that.
Steve, so you bring up the idea of teams getting stronger during this time, and I hadn't really thought about that until you said it just now. I do think that's true. We've in the way, for us anyways, the way I think it's happened is, we've had leaders within each of our smaller teams who have assumed that responsibility to make sure that we stay tight during this work environment. And I think that there's an opportunity, there's a growth opportunity for staff within that, for me to have a conversation with either the formal or natural leads within these different groups and say, hey, I need you to make sure that Margie is on board, that she's dialed in, she's new, she doesn't really know the culture here. I want you to reach out. It doesn't have to all be from me. And then it becomes a growth opportunity for other people within my team to say, I rely on you as a member of leadership within this organization to help us build this thing. And I think that can make us stronger also. So I think that one of the things I got to do is be a little less ego engaged on all culture comes from me, and that it's more from the whole team.
Right. I think this is a challenge that is felt more acutely within schools, but perhaps schools can provide a really nice roadmap for other industries, in the fact that the mission of education in general, of educating kids, and the mission of your individual district organization is non-negotiable, right? No matter your role within that district, you have to be bought into that mission. It doesn't matter what department you're in. And that is what has allowed so many schools and districts to be successful throughout the pandemic, is the fact that CTOs have seen the opportunity where how they can get involved with supporting social emotional learning, right? Things like that. That was not traditionally something they had to think that much about, but the need arose and they said, okay, what do we need to do here? And this is what we're here for. We're here to help kids. Okay, we're going to do this. The equivalent of that wouldn't necessarily happen in most industries because, well, that's not really part of my purview. So, but it really is so important. And, that's part of the reason why I think that does present challenges around when we have these hybrid type environments, and we do have people who are either by choice or by necessity pretty much going to be brick and mortar, others who are toward the other end of the spectrum, maybe they're more remote or they're a little bit hybrid, is they're coming from different directions. So how do we make sure that the culture is consistent, that everybody understands it the same, and everybody really is a part of it? Because again, that's not always required in maybe other industries that have had remote workers for many, many, many years, right? And sometimes it's like, well, they're full time, but they're basically an independent contract. They don't really, need to be part of the culture. It would be great, I guess, if they were, but they're not. But eventually, you find that when you have those inconsistencies, or you have inconsistencies in application of a policy, we have two people who work for us full time, both of them due to whatever circumstances need to move out of town. One of them, we let them keep their job and work remote. The other one, we say, sorry, you can't. And there's not really a reason why. It's just like, we're just being inconsistent around that. I mean, people pick up on that, right? And they say, is this a place, when I come to work here, I love my job. I really want to work in this district for a few decades if things go the way that we hope. And do I feel like that's a reliable plan? I mean, like all of that stuff, that's a long-term vision, but all of that starts here, right? With this conversation of, do we have a culture that everybody's bought into? How challenging is that piece of, establishing consistency in the culture for employees who are operating in very different contexts, I think, but what do you think about that, Alan?
I'm a little, and maybe this wasn't the intent, but I'm a little stuck on the word consistent. And I don't know how people are going to react to this, but equity and equality are different things. And consistency in approach doesn't mean everybody's going to get to work remote, or that everybody is going to have the same experience. And I'll say, frankly, as we extend that out across the organization, as we've actually had some conversations and maybe attempted to formalize some things, that has rubbed some people outside of technology the wrong way completely, where people who didn't know that I had folks who didn't work 5 days in the office ever, but now suddenly becoming aware of it, got a little bit excited about the idea of, well, why does technology not have to be in the office? And say, technology hasn't been in the office. I mean, you guys didn't know before we got things done. This the nature of the job, right? I mean, it's this, your position might require you to be in the office 4 days, 5 days a week. Somebody else's position, literally, they don't ever need to be in the office. So I would say, and again, maybe I'm just stuck on the word consistency, but I think that is, in some places, threatens to derail the whole process. Because, and in some cases, I think it's not even the people in another department, it's a manager in a department that, going back to Steve's earlier point, really manages by staring at people and, walking by the cube and making sure, I really want to make sure, that you're not looking at a picture of your grandkid right now. I mean, what the heck do I care if they're looking at a picture of their grandkid? If I had a grandkid, I'd look at pictures of them.
Right. I think Freddie, I mean, that's such a good point, and that's, tracks back to the importance of understanding our approach from the beginning, right? And here's why we're making these decisions in these situations. Here's why these roles, it's really important that they're in the building in this way. These roles, it can be a little different. These ones, and so that everybody knows from the beginning, all right, here's what to expect. I understand it. There's logic behind it. It's applied fairly, and we know that we're all paddling in the same direction and it's not, it's not feeling haphazard, because we all understand that. And it's that the thoughtfulness of that approach from day one. Have you found that to kind of be effective when we're, because it's completely true, right? There are such a diverse variety of roles and departments and needs and what makes sense, and there's logic to it all, but it's very important that everybody understands how that applies to them.
Yeah, I mean, as leaders, that's a part of our job, is to communicate that why. And the technology department has had mostly itinerant staff for the past decade, and so we thought about these things years ago, and now they're coming back up to the surface as we're leading the larger organization through this change. And so communication and sometimes being able to distinguish the why is really important as we look towards these changes.
As we close here, I would love to take an opportunity here to go around the group here, and speaking, of course, to our tech leader listeners, and think about, as we are rapidly moving into this new hybrid ecosystem, what are a few of the qualities or competencies that you think tech leaders need to focus on developing? Maybe it's a few that you found yourselves developing, or others that you just kind of reflected on and thought about, yeah, this and this are super important in being able to navigate these needs. So how about we'll start with Steve on this one.
It's easy sometimes when we get together and we're sharing practices to think everything's smooth and people have things figured out. And I think it's really important for us to know that we're all trying to figure this out. And so I would say this work is complex, it's challenging. A competency that I think can help in that area is we need, as leaders, to understand that our role is to provide very clear guardrails, or guide rails, not guardrails, but guide rails for staff expectations, so people know and can operate within those. And at the same time, we've also got to hold this idea that our staff are professionals, and we need to treat them as such. And when they do, they rise well beyond our expectations for the most part. And when not, we've got clear processes. We've had people who said, remote work doesn't work for me. I need to be in the office. I'm too distracted. Okay, we're going to make a space for you because we don't want to lose you. So I think in terms of that competency, I would say it's really around providing those guide rails, creating processes that are commonly understood, and then supporting staff wherever they're at in their comfort level, and then connecting that to the culture of the team.
I'm glad Steve brought up the idea that it's hard work. I think, and this wasn't where my answer was going to go, is I think it's important that we've talked, Steve, Freddie, and I, about how we've tried to make this work, but I think it's also important that we acknowledge the struggle in what we're doing here. And I would say that's not just professionally, but it's also personally. I mean, I've had conversations with staff members about how they are dealing with the pandemic, how it's affecting their lives, how it's affecting their professional life, their personal life, and what they need as a human being on this planet. And I think more purposeful, thoughtful conversation that acknowledges, man, it's hard. It's hard doing this work. It's hard being a person. It's hard raising kids. It's hard educating kids, and having those conversations, those honest conversations about how are we making this work? Because here's something that ain't working for me. And, Steve and Freddie sure seem to have it together, but I feel like I'm falling apart. So what are you guys doing? And then engaging in those conversations. I think that's super important for us to do. Steve and I've known each other for a long time. He knows I am not naturally good at that conversation.
Freddie, you get the last word.
I mean, I do think it kind of boils down to relationships, because the relationships that we make both in the department, within the organization, foster all of these things. They foster communication, they foster listening and honesty. So that's really where it boils down to me, is the relationships that we have and maintain within the district.
Well, I think that's a great point to close on, and it's clear that you've all put a lot of thought into this, and that you're continuing to think deeply about it. And these trends are just going to continue and continue. Right? It's not something that's ever going to be finalized. We'll see things continue to change, and that's why it's important, I think, that as leaders, we put our heads together and continue to share successes, share challenges, and work towards solutions. So thank you to Steve, Alan, and Freddie for taking the time to be a part of the COSN podcast. And before we close, I do want to thank the sponsors of COSN's Large Districts Great Minds series: Amazon Web Services, ClassLink, Clever, Content Keeper Technologies, FileWave, and Google. So listeners, make sure you subscribe to the podcast to hear the remaining episodes in this mini-series, along with upcoming episodes on a variety of other topics critical to school technology leaders. And thank you once again to our guests today. Thank you for listening to this episode of the COSN podcast, produced in partnership with MindRocket Media Group. Visit mindrocketmediagroup.com to connect with our expert team and learn how we can support your education industry, communications, and marketing goals. And to make sure you never miss an episode of the podcast, subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. You can also listen to each new episode on edcircuit.com or cosn.org.